On a Tuesday morning in late October of 1987, a man named Lyle Ostrander stood in the gravel lot outside the Stafford County Co-op and watched his reputation drain away like rainwater through a cracked foundation. He had driven 40 minutes from his farm to tell the assembled men, the dealers, the implement salesmen, the other farmers who gathered there on Tuesday mornings the way other men gathered at barber shops, that he needed help. His John Deere 4440 had thrown a rod, his grain auger had seized, and the boy who showed up at his gate that afternoon with a rusted flatbed truck and a request to haul away his broken equipment had been 17 years old, wearing a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large, and offering nothing in the way of credentials except a quiet certainty that made Lyle uncomfortable in a way he could not name. Let me tell you about Harlan Bontrager, because you need to understand the boy before you can understand what he built. Harlan was born in 1970, the third son of Emmett Bontrager, who farmed 320 acres of heavy black ground in the northwest corner of Stafford County, Kansas. Emmett was a good farmer in the way that the land demanded, consistent, methodical, and utterly without imagination. He planted winter wheat in the fall and milo in the summer, and he had done this since 1958, and his father had done it before him, and the land had rewarded this consistency with yields that were never spectacular but were never catastrophic either. The Bontrager farm was the kind of operation that county agents used as a baseline, not a model, not a cautionary tale, just a baseline. Emmett drove a 1974 Ford pickup that he kept in good repair, and he wore the same 4 flannel shirts in rotation, and he did not waste words or money or time, and he expected his sons to be the same. Harlan was not the same. Let me tell you about what Harlan was, because it matters. By the time he was 10 years old, he had taken apart and reassembled every piece of equipment on his father's farm that he could lift, carry, or reach with a step stool, not to fix them. Not because they were broken, because he wanted to know how they worked. Emmett found him once with the carburetor from the old Farmall H spread across the workbench in 14 separate pieces, each piece laid out in a row with the careful precision of a surgeon's tray. And Harlan had looked up and said, without being asked, that the float needle was worn, and that was why the engine ran rich on cold mornings. He was 11. Emmett had stood there for a long moment and then walked back to the house without saying anything, because there was nothing to say. The boy was right. By the time Harlan was 14, he had read every issue of the Implement and Tractor Journal going back to 1961 that he could find at the county library and the estate sales of retired farmers. By 15, he had a working knowledge of metallurgy that would have surprised a Vo-Tech instructor. By 16, he had rebuilt a cracked engine block using a technique he had read about in a 1968 welding manual, a repair that the John Deere dealer in town had told his father was impossible without a replacement block. The dealer's name was Mitch Prescott, and he had been selling equipment in Stafford County for 11 years, and he had the handshake of a man who believed his handshake meant something. When Emmett drove the repaired tractor past the dealership 3 weeks after Mitch had declared it unfixable, Mitch had watched from the window and said nothing. That was the first time. It would not be the last. Now let me tell you about what Harlan started doing in the fall of 1987, because this is where the story actually begins, and it begins the way most important things begin in Stafford County, quietly, without announcement, and with everyone else looking the other direction. He was 17 years old, and he had begun driving the county roads on Saturday mornings in his father's old flatbed truck, the one Emmett had replaced with a newer model and left sitting behind the machine shed with flat tires and a cracked windshield. Harlan had fixed the tires and replaced the windshield with a piece of safety glass he had cut himself from a salvage yard sheet, and every Saturday he drove the roads of Stafford County looking for what other people had given up on. Broken cultivators left at the ends of driveways, cracked anvils sitting outside blacksmith shops that had closed, seized hydraulic cylinders stacked behind implement sheds, old cast-iron gear housings with stress fractures running through them like dry creek beds. He knocked on doors and asked if he could haul the broken things away, and most farmers said yes, because broken equipment takes up space, and space costs money, and nobody was going to fix a cracked anvil in 1987, not when you could buy a new one. He never offered money. He never asked for money. He just asked if he could take it. Most people said yes, without asking why. A few asked what he planned to do with it. He told them he was going to fix it. They nodded the way you nod at something you don't believe but don't want to argue about. And then they watched the flatbed pull away down the county road with their broken junk rattling in the back, and they went back inside and didn't think about it again. Lyle Ostrander was not one of those people. Let me tell you about Lyle, because you need to understand what kind of man laughs the way he laughed and what that laugh costs him later. Lyle was 53 years old in 1987, and he had farmed 640 acres in the middle of Stafford County for 30 years, and he had opinions about most things and shared them freely. He was not a cruel man. He was not even a dishonest man. He was the kind of man who had been right about enough things over enough years that he had stopped considering the possibility of being wrong. He knew what worked and what didn't work, and what was worth a man's time and what wasn't, and a 17-year-old boy hauling cracked anvils and broken hydraulic cylinders in a salvage glass flatbed truck was not worth a man's time. He told Harlan this directly on a Saturday morning in late September of 1987 when Harlan knocked on his door and asked about the pile of broken equipment behind his machine shed. "Son," Lyle said, leaning against the door frame with his coffee cup, "you see that pile back there? That's 30 years of things that can't be fixed. I've had welders look at that anvil. I've had the John Deere man look at those cylinders. You know what they all said?" He didn't wait for an answer. They said the same thing, scrap metal. You want to haul it to the scrapyard? Fine. But don't tell me you're going to fix it because I've been farming this county since before you were born, and I know what can't be fixed. Harlan looked at the pile for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think that anvil's cracked through the face. I think it's a surface fracture. There's a difference." Lyle looked at him. Then he started laughing. Now let me pause here and ask you something, because the laugh matters more than most people realize. When Lyle Ostrander laughed at Harlan Bontrager that September morning, it was not the laugh of a man who had considered the argument and found it wanting. It was the laugh of a man who had not considered the argument at all, because the argument was coming from a 17-year-old boy in an oversized canvas jacket, and in Lyle Ostrander's world, that was all the information he needed. The laugh was a door closing. It was a verdict delivered without a trial. And the thing about that kind of laugh, the kind that comes out before the brain has finished processing what was actually said, is that it tells you more about the laugher than it does about the thing being laughed at. Lyle waved his hand at the pile. "Take whatever you want, son, and when you figure out it's scrap, the yard on Route 56 gives you 40 cents a pound." Harlan thanked him. He loaded the anvil, 3 hydraulic cylinders, a cracked cast-iron gear, housing from a 1952 Minneapolis Moline, and a set of broken cultivator shanks. He drove home. He did not say anything to his father about what Lyle had said. Let me tell you about the shed, because the shed is the whole story. Harlan had been working on the machine shed behind the Bontrager farmhouse since he was 15 years old. It had started as a place to store his father's equipment out of the weather, a practical project that Emmett had approved without enthusiasm. But over 2 years, Harlan had expanded it, insulated it, run a proper 220-volt electrical circuit to it, and installed a coal forge that he had built himself from fire brick and a hand-crank blower he had found at an estate sale in Pratt County. He had a post vise that weighed 140 pounds. Bolted to a section of telephone pole sunk in concrete. He had an arc welder, a gas torch, a drill press, and a surface grinder that he had assembled from 3 separate broken grinders, taking the working components from each. He had a collection of metallurgy textbooks, welding manuals, and machinists' handbooks stacked on a plywood shelf above the workbench, and he had read all of them more than once. What he had built, without naming it or advertising it or asking anyone's permission, was a blacksmith and metalworking shop of a quality that would have impressed a professional. In Stafford County, Kansas, in 1987, nobody knew it existed except Emmett, who walked through it once, looked at the forge, looked at the grinder, looked at the shelf of books, and said, "Don't burn the shed down." That was the extent of his endorsement. Harlan worked on the broken equipment every evening after school and every weekend. He worked methodically and without hurry, the way his father farmed, but with an attention to the specific nature of each problem that Emmett had never applied to anything. The anvil was, as Harlan had told Lyle, a surface fracture. Not through the face, not through the body, just a stress crack in the top layer of hardened steel that had been there, probably, since the anvil had been dropped off a truck sometime in the 1960s. Harlan ground the crack out with a carbide burr, built it back up with a hard-facing rod, and then dressed the face on the surface grinder until it was flat to within 1/1000th of an inch. The whole repair took 11 hours spread across 3 evenings. When he was done, the anvil face was harder than it had been when it left the factory, because the hard-facing rod he used had a Rockwell hardness rating 12 points above the original steel. The hydraulic cylinders were more complex. 2 of them had scored bores. The inner surface of the cylinder had been scratched by contaminated hydraulic fluid until the scratch marks were deep enough to prevent a seal from seating. The third had a cracked end cap. Harlan bored the 2 scored cylinders on a makeshift boring bar he had built from a piece of drill rod and a carbide insert, then honed the bores with a brake cylinder hone until the surface finish was within specification. He made a new end cap for the 3rd cylinder from a piece of steel bar stock, turned it to dimension on a metal lathe that he had spent 4 months rebuilding from a seized wreck he had hauled out of a machine shop in Hutchinson that had closed in 1983. The lathe alone had taken 200 hours of work and about $180 in parts. It was, when he finished it, a better lathe than it had been when it was new. The cracked gear housing from the Minneapolis Moline was the hardest piece. Cast iron is not forgiving. It cracks along crystalline boundaries in ways that are unpredictable, and welding it requires a preheat process that most shops skip because it takes time and propane and patience, and most shops are short on all 3. Harlan preheated the housing in his forge to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, measured with a contact pyrometer he had borrowed from the Votech school and never returned, then welded the crack with a nickel rod designed for cast iron, then wrapped the whole housing in fiberglass insulation and let it cool for 18 hours so the weld wouldn't contract faster than the surrounding metal and crack again. When it was cool, he ground the weld flush and pressure tested the housing with shop air and soapy water. No leaks, no new cracks. The housing was whole. He had been doing this for 7 months before anyone in Stafford County paid attention. Let me tell you about the Tuesday morning in October when that changed, because it changed the way things always change in a small county, all at once, in front of everyone, in a way nobody could pretend they hadn't seen. Lyle Ostrander had a problem. His neighbor, a man named Dale Crowley, who ran the only implement repair shop in the south end of the county, had told him that the hydraulic cylinders on his grain cart were beyond repair. Dale had looked at them in August, quoted Lyle $1,400 for replacements, and told him they'd be in by harvest. It was now October, harvest was 3 weeks out, and the cylinders had not arrived. Dale had called the distributor. The distributor had called the manufacturer. The manufacturer had said there was a production backlog and the cylinders would ship in January. Lyle had driven to the co-op that Tuesday morning to tell the assembled men what he thought about this situation and what he thought was not printable in a family publication. The men at the co-op counter, Mitch Prescott from the John Deere dealership, 2 implement salesmen from Wichita who were in town for the week, 3 other farmers Lyle's age, and a young agronomist from the county extension office, listened to Lyle's situation with the sympathetic attention of men who were glad the problem was not theirs. Mitch Prescott suggested Lyle call a shop in Wichita that specialized in hydraulic work. One of the Wichita salesmen said he knew a man in Pratt who might have the cylinders in stock. The agronomist suggested Lyle consider renting a grain cart for harvest. None of these suggestions were wrong. None of them were going to solve the problem in 3 weeks. It was one of the other farmers, a quiet man named Ellis Hassel, who farmed the section north of the Bontrager place, who said, almost as an aside, that the Bontrager boy had fixed his PTO shaft housing last spring, and it had held through the whole season without a problem. The co-op counter went quiet in the particular way that co-op counters go quiet when someone says something that doesn't fit the established narrative of how things work. Mitch Prescott set down his coffee cup. "The Bontrager kid? Emmett's boy?" "Harlan," Ellis said. He's got a shop set up out back of their place. Fixed my housing in 2 days. Charged me $40. He's 17 years old, Mitch said. 18 now, Ellis said, and the housing held. Lyle Ostrander had been listening to this exchange with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to be interested or offended. He settled, as he usually did, on a position somewhere between the two. "That's the same kid who hauled off my broken equipment last fall," he said. "Told me he was going to fix it." He paused. I told him it was scrap. There was a moment of silence. Then Mitch Prescott said, "Well, it probably was." Lyle drove out to the Bontrager place that afternoon. He did not call ahead because men of his generation did not call ahead when they were going to see a neighbor. He drove down the county road, turned in at the Bontrager gate, and followed the gravel track past the house to the machine shed in the back. The doors were open. He could hear the sound of a grinder running inside. He stepped through the doors and stopped. Let me tell you about what Lyle Ostrander saw when he stepped into that shed, because this is the moment that the whole story turns on, and I want you to understand it the way he understood it, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece arriving a half second after the last, like a man stepping from a dark room into bright light and waiting for his eyes to adjust. He saw the forge first, because the forge was lit and glowing orange at the far end of the shed, and the heat from it reached him even at the door. He saw the lathe next, running along the right wall, its ways polished and its gears covered with a guard Harlan had fabricated from sheet metal. He saw the post vise, the drill press, the surface grinder, the arc welder with its leads coiled neatly on a hook, the shelf of books above the bench. He saw the hydraulic cylinders from his own grain cart, sitting on the workbench in a row, already disassembled, their components laid out with the same careful precision that Emmett had seen on the workbench 11 years earlier when Harlan was 11 years old and had taken apart the Farmel carburetor. Harlan was at the grinder, working on what appeared to be a cylinder bore. He had not heard Lyle come in over the noise of the machine. He finished the stroke he was on, lifted the hone, and turned off the grinder, and in the sudden quiet he heard Lyle's boots on the concrete floor and turned around. "Mr. Ostrander," he said. Lyle looked at the cylinders on the bench. He looked at the lathe. He looked at the forge. He said, "Ellis Hassel told me you fixed his PTO housing." "Yes, sir." He said it held all season. "It should hold longer than that. I used a nickel rod and preheated the casting." Lyle was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the cylinders. "Those are mine," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I picked them up when I hauled your equipment last fall. I was going to bring them back when they were done." "You were going to bring them back." Lyle said this slowly, as if he were translating from a foreign language. "Without being asked?" "Yes, sir. I figured you might need them." Lyle stood there for a long moment. He was a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that being wrong was a physical sensation for him, something he felt in his chest before he felt it anywhere else. He felt it now. "How long to finish them?" he said. "Tomorrow afternoon," Harlan said. "I need to hone the second bore and make a new seal kit. I've got the seals on order from Parker Hannafin. They'll be here in the morning." Lyle nodded slowly. He looked around the shed one more time. At the books, at the forge, at the lathe with its polished ways. And then he looked at Harlan, this 18-year-old boy in a canvas jacket and safety glasses, standing in a shop that had no right to exist in the back of a wheat farmer's machine shed in Stafford County, Kansas, and he said, "What do you want for them?" Harlan thought about it. $60, he said, "for both cylinders and the seals." Lyle nodded again. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his wallet and counted out $60 and set it on the workbench. He picked up his hat, which he had taken off when he came inside, and put it back on. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned around. "That anvil," he said. "The one you hauled off last fall." "Yes, sir." "Did you fix it?" Harlan walked to the corner of the shed and lifted a canvas tarp. The anvil sat on a heavy oak stump, its face gleaming under the shed light. Lyle walked over and looked at it. He ran his thumb across the face. It was flat and smooth and hard in a way that working anvils rarely are after 30 years of use. He could not find the crack. He looked for it for a full minute, running his thumb back and forth across the face, and he could not find it. "It's there," Harlan said, "under the hard facing, but it's not going anywhere." Lyle straightened up. He looked at the boy. He was not a man who apologized easily, or who admitted to having been wrong in direct language. But he was not a dishonest man either, and he had been wrong, and he knew it, and the boy standing in front of him knew it. "I'll take it back," he said. "The anvil. What do you want for it?" "It's yours," Harlan said. "It was always yours. I was going to bring it back." Lyle picked up the anvil. It weighed 200 pounds, and he was 53 years old, and it took him a moment, and he carried it to his truck and loaded it in the bed. He drove home. He installed it in his own shop and used it for the next 22 years, until the day he retired and gave it to his son-in-law, who uses it still. He never told anyone at the co-op what he had found in that shed. He did not need to. Word travels in a small county the way water travels in flat ground, quietly, without announcement, and always to the lowest point. Let me tell you about what happened in the 18 months that followed, because this is the part of the story that most people in Stafford County remember, and what they remember is not a single moment, but a series of moments, each one arriving a little faster than the last, like a machine that has found its rhythm and is no longer fighting itself. By the spring of 1988, Harlan had repaired equipment for 11 different farms in the county. He had fixed a cracked cultivator frame for a man named Cyril Vandermeer, who had been told by Dale Crowley that the frame was too far gone to weld. He had rebored and resleeved a cylinder on a 1966 International 706 for a woman named Mildred Tesdall, who had farmed her late husband's 480 acres alone for 6 years and had been quoted $900 for a replacement engine that she could not afford. He had made a replacement gear for a combine header drive that the manufacturer had discontinued in 1979, and for which no replacement existed anywhere in the dealer network. He had measured the original gear, calculated the tooth profile, and cut a new one from a piece of steel bar stock on the lathe, a job that took him 14 hours and that he charged $85 for. The combine ran the entire 1988 harvest without a problem. Mitch Prescott heard about the gear. He drove out to the Bontrager place on a Wednesday afternoon in May, uninvited, and stood in the shed doorway with his arms crossed and watched Harlan work for a few minutes before he spoke. Mitch was 44 years old and had a dealership that did $2.3 million in annual sales and a service department with 3 certified technicians, and he had built all of it himself from a used equipment lot. He had started with $15,000 and a borrowed truck in 1977. And he was proud of what he had built in the way that self-made men are proud, completely and with very little room for revision. "You know you're not certified," Mitch said. "You're not a licensed repair shop. You've got no liability coverage. If something you fix breaks and someone gets hurt, you're done." Harlan set down the file he was using and looked at Mitch. "I know," he said. "So what's your plan?" "To get certified," Harlan said. "I'm starting at Hutchinson Community College in the fall. Diesel technology and welding. 2 years. Mitch looked at the lathe. He looked at the forge. He looked at the shelf of books. He was quiet for a moment. "That gear you made for Virgil Gustafson's combine," he said. "The header drive gear." "Yes, sir." "Where'd you learn to cut gears?" "Machinery's Handbook," Harlan said, "and a lot of trial and error." Mitch looked at him for a long time. He was a man who understood business, and what he was looking at was a business. Not yet, not legally, not with the proper licenses and insurance and a sign on the road, but the bones of one, and the bones were better than anything he had seen come out of a VOTEC program in 11 years of hiring technicians. He did not say this. He uncrossed his arms. He said, "You need anything, you let me know," and he walked back to his truck and drove away. It was the closest thing to an endorsement that Mitch Prescott had ever given anyone who wasn't on his payroll, and everyone who heard about it understood it for what it was. Let me tell you about the summer of 1989. because that summer is when the shed stopped being a secret and became something else entirely. Harlan had finished his first year at Hutchinson Community College with the highest grade point average in the diesel technology program. His instructor, a man named Howard Brockman, who had spent 20 years as a field engineer for Caterpillar before retiring to teach, had told the department head that Harlan was the most mechanically intuitive student he had encountered in 12 years of teaching, and that the boy's understanding of metallurgy was already beyond what the program covered. Howard had given Harlan a key to the school's machine shop and told him he could use it on weekends, an arrangement that was technically against policy and that Howard had cleared with no one. Harlan used it every Saturday from October through April. He came home in May of 1989, and the word had already spread. Farmers from the north end of the county were calling the Bontrager house and leaving messages with Emmett, who wrote them down on the back of seed corn envelopes and left them on the workbench in the shed without comment. Farmers from the next county over had heard about the discontinued gear and the cylinder rebore and the cracked cast iron housing, and they were driving past the Bontrager place on county roads on pretexts that fooled no one. Slowing down to look at the machine shed the way people slow down to look at something they've heard about but aren't sure they believe. Harlan spent that summer working 12-hour days in the shed. He hired a boy from town to help him with the heavy lifting, a 16-year-old named Aaron Kowalski, who had no mechanical knowledge whatsoever, but who was strong and willing, and who, over the course of that summer, learned more about metallurgy and machine work than most people learn in a 2-year program, because Harlan explained everything he did as he did it, not because he was a natural teacher, but because thinking out loud helped him catch his own mistakes. By the end of that summer, Harlan had repaired equipment for 37 different operations in Stafford County and 4 operations in the neighboring county. He had a waiting list. He had a liability insurance policy, a business license from the county, and a name, Bontrager Metalworks, that his mother had suggested and that he had put on a hand-painted sign at the end of the driveway. White letters on a green board, the paint applied with a brush that had been used for barn trim and was slightly too wide for the lettering, so the edges of the letters were not perfectly sharp. The sign stayed that way for 6 years, because Harlan was not the kind of man who spent time on things that were working fine. Mitch Prescott drove past the sign one morning and saw it and called the dealership from his truck phone and told his service manager that they needed to talk about their turnaround times because there was a kid on the county road who was eating their lunch on repair work and had a waiting list, and that was not a situation that reflected well on an operation with 3 certified technicians and a $180,000 parts inventory. Let me tell you about the moment the county understood what Harlan had been doing all along, because it came in the fall of 1991, and it came the way vindication always comes in a small county, not with a parade, but with a problem that only one person could solve. The fall of 1991 brought a harvest that was everything Stafford County had hoped for: heavy yields, good prices, dry weather in September, and then, in the second week of October, it brought a parts failure that threatened to cost the county's largest operation its entire crop. The operation belonged to a man named Warren Steinmetz, who farmed 2,800 acres in the middle of the county, and who ran 2 John Deere 7720 combines, and one of those combines had thrown a ring gear on its separator drive, a ring gear that was specific to that model and that year, and that John Deere's parts system showed as available with a 6-week lead time. 6 weeks. The crop would be in the bin or on the ground in 3 weeks. Mitch Prescott had called every dealer in a 200-mile radius. He had called the regional parts warehouse. He had called a dealer in Nebraska who sometimes had old stock. Nothing. The ring gear did not exist within driving distance, and it could not be shipped faster than 6 weeks, and Warren Steinmetz was looking at 1,400 acres of standing corn and a combine that would not run. Warren drove to the Bontrager place on a Monday morning and found Harlan in the shed, already working on a cylinder head for someone else's tractor. Warren was 61 years old and had farmed this county for 40 years and was not a man who asked for help easily, and what he said when he walked through the shed door was not a request so much as a statement of facts laid in front of another man and left there. "My 7720 is down," Warren said. "Ring gear on the separator drive. John Deere says 6 weeks. Harlan wiped his hands on a shop rag. Do you have the broken gear? In the truck. Let me see it. Warren brought it in. Harlan set it on the workbench and looked at it for a long time, turning it in his hands, measuring it with a caliper, counting the teeth, checking the pitch with a gear tooth gauge from his toolbox. The gear was a 72-tooth ring gear, 10-pitch, 20-degree pressure angle, made from a medium carbon steel with a case-hardened tooth surface. It was not a simple piece. Cutting it would require the gear hobbing attachment for the lathe that Harlan had built the previous winter from a set of plans he had found in a 1971 machinist's journal, an attachment that he had used successfully on 3 previous jobs, but never on a gear this large. I can make it, Harlan said. It'll take 4 days, maybe 5. Warren looked at him. Warren had heard the stories. The cylinders, the housing, the discontinued gear for Virgil Gustafson's combine, but he was 61 years old and had 1,400 acres of standing corn, and this was not the moment for stories. Can you make it run? He said. Not just make it run. I can make it run, Harlan said. If it doesn't, I'll make another one until it does, but it'll run. Warren left the broken gear on the workbench and drove home. Harlan called Aaron Kowalski and told him to come in early the next morning. He called Howard Brockman at Hutchinson and asked him 2 questions about gear hobbing tolerances for case-hardened applications, and Howard answered them from memory without hesitation, because that was the kind of man Howard Brockman was. Then Harlan went to the shelf of books, pulled down the machinery's handbook, opened it to the gear design section, and began calculating. He worked for 96 hours across 4 days, sleeping 4 hours a night on a cot he had set up in the corner of the shed for harvest season. He made the gear blank on the lathe, roughed the teeth with the hobbing attachment, finished them with a rotary file, and a tooth-by-tooth check with the gear tooth gauge. Heat-treated the finished gear in the forge, using a case-hardening compound and a quench tank he had built from a 55-gallon drum, and then tempered it in the forge at 350 degrees for 2 hours to relieve the quench stress. When it was done, he measured every tooth with the gauge and every dimension with the caliper and compared the numbers to the measurements he had taken from the broken gear, and every number was within 0.02 of an inch. He called Warren on Thursday afternoon. Warren drove over, looked at the gear, picked it up, and turned it in his hands the way a man handles something he is trying to decide whether to trust. He did not say anything for a long time. Put it in, Harlan said. If it doesn't run right, bring it back. Warren put it in that afternoon with Aaron Kowalski helping with the installation. The combine started. The separator drive ran. Warren Steinmetz ran that combine for 14 hours a day for the next 18 days and harvested 1,400 acres of corn without stopping. And the ring gear that Harlan Bontrager had made in 4 days on a lathe in a machine shed on a wheat farm in Stafford County, Kansas, did not slip, did not crack, did not wear, and did not fail. Mitch Prescott heard about it the day after harvest ended when Warren mentioned it at the co-op. Mitch drove out to the Bontrager place that afternoon. He sat in his truck in the driveway for a moment before he got out, which was unusual for him because Mitch Prescott was not a man who sat in his truck thinking before he got out. He was a man who got out of his truck and said what he had come to say and went back to his dealership. But he sat there for a moment, and then he got out and walked to the shed and knocked on the open door frame. Harlan looked up from the workbench. "The ring gear," Mitch said. "Warren told me." "It held," Harlan said. "I know it held." Mitch was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lathe, at the forge, at the shelf of books. He had been in this shed twice before, and each time it had been larger and better equipped than the last, and now it was something that he could not dismiss with the language of dismissal he had used 3 years ago. "I told you in '88 that you weren't certified," he said. "I know you did. You're certified now." 2 years ago, Harlan said. Mitch nodded. He looked at the floor. He was a self-made man, and he understood what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was a man who had built something from nothing in the same way he had built something from nothing, except that what Harlan had built was better than what Mitch had built in the specific ways that mattered most to the farmers of Stafford County. he said. "I've got a service department that can't cut a gear. I've got 3 certified techs who wouldn't know where to start." He paused. "I'm not saying I was wrong." "I know you're not," Harlan said. "But I'm saying—" Mitch stopped. He looked at the shelf of books. He started again. "I've got a customer with a 4955 that needs a crankshaft regrind. The nearest shop that can do it is in Wichita. 2 weeks turnaround, $600. Can you do it?" Harlan looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. 4 days, $280. Mitch nodded once. He turned and walked back to his truck. He drove to the dealership and told his service manager to start routing crankshaft regins and specialty machining to Bontrager Metalworks on the county road, and his service manager said, "The kid in the barn," and Mitch said, "The man in the shop," and that was the end of that conversation. Let me tell you about what happened to the shed over the next decade, because the shed is not the shed anymore and hasn't been for a long time, and the story of how it changed is the story of how a county changes when it finally decides to pay attention to what was always there. By 1995, Bontrager Metalworks had outgrown the machine shed. Harlan had built an addition to the south side of the original structure, poured a new concrete floor, added a second lathe, a milling machine, a cylindrical grinder, and a plasma cutting table. He had hired 3 full-time employees, including Aaron Kowalski, who had been with him since the summer of 1989 and who was now a journeyman machinist with a certificate from Hutchinson Community College that he had earned while working full-time, because Harlan had told him to go get it and had adjusted his hours to make it possible. He had a service agreement with Mitch Prescott's dealership, a contract with the county road department for equipment repair, and a reputation that extended into 4 neighboring counties. He was 25 years old. The original machine shed, the one with the coal forge and the lathe built from salvage and the shelf of books, was still standing at the north end of the building. Harlan had not torn it down when he built the addition. He had kept the forge lit and the lathe running and the books on the shelf, not because he needed them the way he had needed them in 1987, but because they were where the whole thing had started, and he was not the kind of man who forgot where things started. Let me tell you about Lyle Ostrander one more time, because the story has a last chapter that belongs to him, and it is a better chapter than his first one. Lyle retired from farming in 1999 at 65 and sold his 640 acres to a corporate operation from Wichita that planted it all in continuous corn and ran it with GPS-guided equipment and a hired manager who drove out from the city twice a week. Lyle moved into town and spent his mornings at the co-op the way he always had, and he watched the county change around him the way men of his generation watch things change, with a complicated mixture of resignation and grief and occasional grudging admiration. He came to Bontrager Metalworks one morning in the spring of 2001. He drove in and parked and walked through the main shop door and stood there for a moment, looking at the milling machine and the cylindrical grinder and the 3 employees working at their stations, and then he walked through the door at the north end that led to the original shed where Harlan was working at the old lathe. The forge was lit. The shelf of books was still there. Lyle stood in the doorway. He was 77 years old, and he had the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided, finally, to set it down. "I told you it was scrap," he said. Harlan looked up from the lathe. "Yes, sir. I was wrong." "I know." Lyle looked at the anvil in the corner, not his anvil, which was at his son-in-law's place, but a different one. A 300-pound Fisher that Harlan had hauled off a closed blacksmith shop in 1988 and repaired and used ever since. He looked at the forge. He looked at the shelf of books. He said, "How did you know? When you were 17, how did you know what you had?" Harlan thought about it for a moment. He turned off the lathe. He said, "I didn't know what I had. I just knew what the metal needed. The metal doesn't care who's asking." Lyle was quiet for a long time. He looked at the forge, at the orange glow of it, at the heat shimmering above the firepot. He said, "No, I suppose it doesn't." He stayed for an hour. He looked at everything in the original shed, the way a man looks at things he wishes he had looked at sooner. He asked questions about the lathe and the forge and the hard-facing rod, and Harlan answered them all, and when Lyle left, he shook Harlan's hand at the door and said, "You built something here," and Harlan said, "Yes, sir," and that was all. Lyle died in 2009 at 75. He left the Anvil, the one Harlan had repaired, the one with the hard-faced surface that was harder than the day it left the factory, to his son-in-law with a note that said the Anvil had been fixed by a man named Bontrager on the county road, and that it would outlast anything bought new, and to treat it accordingly. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Lyle, and it doesn't end with the Anvil, and it doesn't end with the ring gear or the cylinders or the cracked cast-iron housing from the Minneapolis Moline. Aaron Kowalski's youngest daughter is 19 years old now. She grew up spending Saturday mornings in the shop, handing tools to her father and listening to Harlan explain what he was doing and why. And she has her father's certificate from Hutchinson Community College and a second certificate in materials science from Kansas State. And last spring she came to Harlan with a proposal. She had been reading about powder metallurgy, the process of sintering metal powders under heat and pressure to create components with properties that conventional machining cannot achieve, and she believed that the shop could add a sintering capability for $40,000 in equipment and open a market in custom agricultural components that nobody in a 300-mile radius was serving. Harlan listened to her for 45 minutes without interrupting. She had a notebook with her, the pages filled with calculations and diagrams and cost projections and citations from materials science journals, and she set it on the workbench between them and walked him through it page by page. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the shelf of books above the bench, the same shelf, the same books, the machinery's handbook and the welding manuals and the metallurgy texts, worn now and marked with grease and pencil, and the fingerprints of 35 years of use. He said yes. She looked at him. Just yes? Just yes, he said. Order the equipment. She ordered the equipment. The sintering press arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and Harlan helped her uncrate it and install it and run the first test cycle. And when the first test piece came out of the press, a small gear, blank, dense and precise, and made from a powder that no conventional machining process could have produced. He held it in his hand for a moment and turned it over and looked at it the way he had looked at broken things all his life, with the same attention and the same patience and the same certainty that the material had something to tell him if he was willing to listen. He set it on the workbench next to the machinery's handbook. He went back to work. The forge is still lit in the original shed. The lathe that Harlan built from salvage in 1987 still runs, though it hasn't been used for production work in 15 years. The shelf of books is still there. Emmett Bontrager's 4 flannel shirts are gone, and Emmett is gone. And the wheat fields he farmed for 40 years are planted in continuous corn by a GPS-guided machine operated by a man from Wichita who has never been inside the shed. But the shed is there. The sign at the end of the driveway is still green with white letters, repainted once in 2003, but in the same hand, with the same slightly too wide brush, so the edges of the letters are still not perfectly sharp. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for the right person to understand what they were always for. The boy hauled off their cracked anvils. He fixed what they said couldn't be fixed. He built what they said couldn't be built. He made a gear in 4 days that a manufacturer said would take 6 weeks, and it ran, and it held, and it never failed. They laughed when he loaded the flatbed. The flatbed is still running.